can't explain how sentience ever comes out of insentient matter. And so the assumption we don't dare question is that matter is insentient.
It's interesting, a lot of the people that I've spoken with are, obviously pushed right up against this hard problem, of how to do this. But even many of the sort of spiritually minded people I've found are trying to, they're feeling compelled to accommodate the materialist worldview because I think it's so compelling and gaining so much momentum that what a lot of people have said to me in response to this kind of questioning is, well, our understanding of matter just has to change. That they'll kind of be saying, well, we just have to start to realize that maybe part of what matter is conscious or this kind of thing, but they still want to stay physicalists,
right?
Or material or naturalist physicalists, And what do you think about that? Because you're going somewhere different, right?
Yes, I end up going somewhere very different indeed from that. Well, where I start from is where we got to at the moment is what I call a dual aspect to existence. That there is an interior aspect to everything as well as the apparent physical aspect. But then, if I start looking at what modern science is pointing to, particularly I'm talking here about physics really, and the physics of matter. When we start looking at what physics is telling us, it's first of all saying that when we look at what we thought was solid matter isn't solid at all. When we look at an atom, for example, it's mostly empty space. It's just like there's a tiny thing in the middle called a nucleus, which is a collection of neutrons and protons, and then these electrons flying around it, and it's mostly space. I mean, a fairly good model is if you imagine the nucleus the size of a golf ball, then the electrons are like peas floating around about 300 feet away, spinning around 300 feet away. So it's like a football stadium with a golf ball in the middle and peas flying around the stands. It's that much empty space. And then, when we look at that deeper, when we go in, I mean, that's just basic atomic physics. When we go into quantum physics and go down deeper, we find that the idea of a neutron or an electron or a proton being particles is just an idea we have that we've projected onto the world. In fact, all of physics is ideas in the mind that we draw from our own experience and we then project onto what we think is the physical world, and we find there are no particles there. There's just basically the potentiality for certain observations being made, and it ends up as just mathematical equations. And it turns out there really is nothing there. I mean, in the sense that there is no thing there. And the thingness seems to be something that we imagine in our mind, but when we get down to it, we find there isn't anything there. And the view I've been exploring recently is supposing there is only experience there. There is just the fundamental nature of the cosmos is what all the great mystics and spiritual teachers have been saying for a long time, not all of them, but many of them, that the fundamental nature of the cosmos is consciousness. And then, and it's we don't really have the language for this, but you can imagine that consciousness gets differentiated, it's almost like tied up in knots, and like a little knot of consciousness may appear as an electron to another little knot of consciousness. So in this model you have a universe where everything is consciousness experiencing everything else. And if you have to use language very loosely here, but like in the mind of an electron, which is just a consciousness itself, it creates its image of another electron over there. And so the thingness is an appearance in the mind. And so you can what I've arrived at is actually a sort of a conscious monism, where everything is actually consciousness. There is no material aspect, but the materiality arises in the experience. So when I experience the world, what emerges in my mind is this experience of color, sound, shape, form, and also this experience of hard materiality. But I think ultimately that is something which appears in the mind. And just as we know, I mean, for example, to go back a step, when I see colour, when I see the colour green, that is only a quality that emerges in the mind. There is no greenness out there in the physical world. There is light of a certain frequency, and even then, that's just what we tend to call it. There is light, let's say, of a certain frequency. That frequency is interpreted by the brain as green, and gives rise to the appearance in the mind of greenness, but the greenness is only in the mind. And I think that's true of every quality we experience. When I hear, when you're hearing my voice now, there's just sound vibration, there's movement of air molecules, or whatever it is, photons going down the fiber. The sound that you hear is a response in the mind to that signal. So that's creation in the mind. And I'm going a step further and saying that's also true of what we think of as matter, that materiality is a response, a creation of the mind to the information it's receiving about the world.
So are you saying that independent of a perceiver, there is no material world? Or yes. Are you saying, or whatever that material world is?
What I'm saying is that what we call the material world is not made of what we think of as matter.
Okay.
That's the first step. There is what we think of as matter doesn't actually exist. That exists only in the mind, and we make the mistake of imagining, let's call it the physical world. We imagine the physical world is made of matter. And what physics has now shown us is that is not true. It looks like that. It certainly looks like that, and it certainly behaves like that. But when you dig down deep, there is no matter there. And at the moment, I think we are still stuck in the assumption that there is some physicalness there. It may not be matter in any way that we think of as matter, but there's some physicalness. And what I've been thinking is maybe that we have to let go of that assumption. There may be ultimately no physicalness. It's all what we think of as physicalness is the way we create the experience of it in our mind.
Okay. Because you're not saying there aren't rocks and trees out there. You're just saying that what rocks and trees are is not what we think they are.
Right. Yeah. There's nothing. There's no thing there. There's no material thing there.
Because it's mostly space anyway.
Well, first of all, it's mostly space. And then even when we take the bit that we think isn't space, we find there aren't even electrons and protons there. They're names we give to what we discover in our experiments. But we're now discovering that an electron, what we called an electron and what we assumed was some little tiny lump of matter, isn't that at all. I mean, it appears like a bit of matter. Sometimes it appears like a wave another time. But all we can really say, and this is what comes out of quantum physics, is just there is the potential there for a particular observation, the potential for a particular experience.
Would you say it's a kind of information that then we, with our brains and minds, are able to process that information in a way that gives us this experience of a tangible world? Yes.
There is information, and I think that information is structured in consciousness. What I see is the underlying field. I mean, just go back a second, what you were saying. I am not saying there isn't a physical world.
Right.
I believe there is a physical world that we are experiencing. It's just not made of physical stuff.
Okay.
So what I'm hypothesizing is that the actual essence of the cosmos is actually consciousness. But it is not a uniform field of consciousness. That the unified field, which I think physics is moving towards, is actually a field of consciousness. And that consciousness it's differentiated. It's not a uniform field. It has differences. And those differences are, if you like, the fundamental particles. And they interact and create disappearance of matter.